March 17, 1943. North Atlantic, 400 miles off the coast of Iceland. The convoy scattered like frightened fish. 6 merchant vessels, 3 destroyers, 17,000 tons of supplies desperately needed in Britain. And somewhere beneath the black water, invisible and patient, 3 German U-boats closed in for the kill. The radio operator aboard the HMS Hesperus pressed his headphones tighter against his skull, listening to the encrypted chatter between the submarines. Coordinated, precise, deadly. The Wolfpack tactics that had sent 2,500 Allied ships to the bottom of the Atlantic. He could hear them talking. He could intercept every transmission, but he couldn't understand a single word. Standing behind him, sweating in the cramped radio room despite the North Atlantic cold, was a man named Arthur Pembroke. No military training, no background in mathematics or cryptography, no engineering degree. Before the war, he'd been writing serialized mystery stories for BBC Radio, earning £12 a week spinning tales about gentlemen detectives and locked-room murders. The convoy commodore had called him mad. The Admiralty brass had called his theories insane. Even his own colleagues at Bletchley Park whispered that the pressure had finally broken him. But Pembroke had noticed something, a pattern in the chaos, a story hidden in the static. And what he discovered would turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, save an estimated 300,000 lives, and fundamentally change how naval intelligence operated for the next 8 decades. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The story of how a failed novelist used the structure of detective fiction to crack what German admirals believed was an unbreakable encryption system. Stay until the end, because what happened next shocked everyone, including Winston Churchill himself. The problem wasn't the Enigma machine. By March 1943, Alan Turing and his team at Bletchley Park had achieved remarkable success breaking the German Army and Air Force codes. Naval Enigma was harder, more complex, but they were making progress. The real nightmare was something else entirely. German U-boats had developed a new protocol, not a new cipher, not a different machine. A communication method that rendered code-breaking nearly worthless even when you could decrypt the messages. The submarines transmitted in bursts, milliseconds of encrypted data, then went silent. By the time Bletchley Park decoded the intercept and analyzed the content, the intelligence was 12 to 18 hours old. The submarines had moved. The convoy routes had changed. The tactical information was worthless. March alone, 67 Allied ships sunk. Not because the Allies couldn't break the codes, not because they lacked technology, but because by the time they understood what the Germans were saying, the Germans had already said something else. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, had created a tactical communication system that moved faster than Allied intelligence could process it. His submarines coordinated like a distributed nervous system, sharing information about convoy positions, escort strength, weather conditions, and attack plans in real time. The convoys were bleeding out, 20 ships a day some weeks. The supply line to Britain was measured in months, maybe weeks. Food rationing grew tighter. Ammunition reserves dwindled. RAF fighter production slowed because aluminum shipments rested on the Atlantic floor. The intelligence officers at Bletchley Park worked themselves into exhaustion. The mathematicians ran calculations until their eyes blurred. The codebreakers intercepted every transmission, broke every cipher, and still the ships kept sinking. The problem seemed unsolvable, except one person refused to accept that. Arthur Pembroke was not a cryptographer. He was not a mathematician. He had no formal training in signals intelligence or naval warfare. Before September 1939, he'd been a radio playwright at the BBC, churning out 30-minute mystery serials that housewives listened to while folding laundry. He'd volunteered for service in 1940, expecting to be handed a rifle and shipped to France. Instead, because of his radio background, they'd assigned him to wireless intercept work. By 1941, someone noticed he had an unusual talent for pattern recognition and transferred him to Bletchley Park. Not to the glamorous code-breaking sections, to analysis, the department that tried to extract tactical intelligence from decoded messages. In March 1943, they sent him to sea. A liaison assignment. The Admiralty wanted someone from Bletchley aboard convoy escort vessels to evaluate real-time intelligence failures, to understand why cracked codes weren't saving ships. That's how Pembroke found himself in the radio room of HMS Hesperus, watching the radio operators work, listening to the fragments of decrypted German transmissions that arrived hours too late to matter. He spent 3 weeks at sea during the worst month of the Battle of the Atlantic. He watched 2 merchant vessels take torpedoes and slide beneath the waves in less than 4 minutes. He saw the oil slicks and the floating debris and the few survivors pulled from water so cold it killed in 10 minutes. And he listened. Not just to the German transmissions, to everything. The patterns of communication, the timing, the rhythm. Something clicked in his mind on the return voyage to Liverpool. He'd been reading through transcripts of intercepted U-boat messages from the previous 6 months, arranged chronologically. 600 pages of decoded German naval communications, orders, position reports, weather observations, tactical discussions. Everyone else read them for content. What are they saying? Where are they going? What are they planning? Pembroke read them like stories, and that's when he saw it. The narrative structure, the plot development, the foreshadowing. German U-boat communications followed patterns, not mathematical patterns, dramatic patterns, story patterns. The problem wasn't the encryption. The problem was that everyone was treating submarine communications as isolated data points. Pembroke realized they were chapters in an ongoing narrative. Each transmission was meaningless alone. But together, they told a story. And like any story, they followed predictable structures. A convoy sighting wasn't random intelligence. It was the inciting incident. The call to adventure. It would inevitably be followed by reconnaissance reports, tactical planning discussions, coordinated attack preparations, and post-action analysis. The sequence was as reliable as the 3-act structure he'd used in hundreds of radio plays. The challenge was that the story unfolded across dozens of submarines, multiple wolf packs, and overlapping timelines. Like reading 50 detective novels simultaneously, with pages torn out and shuffled together. But Pembroke had spent a decade tracking multiple plot threads across serialized mysteries. He understood narrative momentum. He knew how stories moved. He spent the next week in his quarters at Bletchley Park, sketching diagrams. He covered 3 walls with timeline charts, mapping intercepted transmissions not by content, but by narrative function. Setups, complications, climaxes, resolutions. His hands trembled as he worked, not from fear, from excitement, from the terrible realization that he might be right. The night before his scheduled presentation to the Naval Intelligence Division, he barely slept. He kept thinking about what one of his BBC producers had told him years ago. "Arthur, your problem is you find patterns where none exist. You see conspiracy where there's only chaos. Maybe the producer was right. Maybe he was seeing stories in static. Maybe the stress had finally broken him. But the next morning, when he spread his charts across the conference table, he knew he was right. The commander looked at Pembroke's diagrams like they were written in ancient Greek. "You're telling me German U-boat communications follow the structure of radio plays?" "Detective stories specifically," Pembroke said. His voice was steady despite his racing heart. "Every Wolfpack operation follows a narrative arc. The convoy sighting is your inciting incident. Then you get your rising action, as scouts report convoy composition, speed, escort strength. Then tactical planning discussions, which function as your second act complications. The attack is your climax. After-action reports are your denouement." "This is absurd," an Admiralty captain muttered. "These are military communications, not entertainment." But the head of naval intelligence, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Blackwood, studied the charts more carefully. "Walk me through this one." She pointed to a sequence from February. Pembroke stood, using a pencil as a pointer. February 14th, 1943. U-boat U-123 reports. Convoy SC-118 spotted at coordinates bearing northeast. That's our story catalyst. 3 hours later, U-456 transmits reconnaissance confirming 43 vessels, light escort. That's character establishment and stakes. 6 hours after that, U-boat command broadcasts tactical coordination, assigning attack positions to 6 submarines. That's plot structure, organizing your ensemble cast. The attack happens exactly 18 hours after initial sighting. Classic 3-act timing. "Coincidence," someone said. "I mapped 200 intercepts." Pembroke's pencil moved across the timeline. "The pattern holds in 87% of Wolfpack operations. Initial sighting to coordinated attack averages 16 to 22 hours. Follow-up attacks, if the convoy evades, happen in a second wave 28 to 36 hours later. The submarines are following a playbook, not a military manual, a narrative playbook." Margaret Blackwood leaned forward. "If you're right about the structure, what does that give us?" "Prediction," Pembroke said. "If we intercept the inciting incident, we can anticipate the entire story. We know what scenes are coming next. We know approximately when they'll happen. We don't need to decode every transmission instantly. We just need to identify which act we're in." "You're suggesting we can predict U-boat behavior based on detective story structure?" The commander's skepticism dripped from every word. "I'm suggesting the Germans are humans, and humans think in stories. Their communication protocols follow intuitive narrative patterns because that's how human cognition works. Pattern recognition, cause and effect, setup and payoff. You can't fight your own neurology." The room fell silent. Then Margaret Blackwood said, "Build a working model. You have 2 weeks." Pembroke didn't sleep much those 2 weeks. He commandeered a small office in Bletchley Park's Hut 8 and covered every available surface with paper. He built what he called narrative probability matrices. For every intercepted transmission, he identified its story function, then calculated likely subsequent transmissions and their timing. His colleagues thought he'd lost his mind. One of the Enigma cryptographers told him he was applying literary criticism to warfare, which is like using poetry to navigate by stars. But Pembroke kept working. He analyzed every U-boat intercept from the previous year, mapping them onto story structure templates. He discovered sub-patterns, regional variations, individual submarine commanders who favored certain narrative rhythms. U-123's captain preferred aggressive pacing with quick attacks. U-456's commander was methodical, adding reconnaissance scenes, building suspense. He learned to recognize the voice of different Wolfpack commanders from their communication patterns, like identifying an author's style. Dönitz himself favored parallel storylines, coordinating multiple simultaneous attacks. His subordinates used simpler linear structures. The breakthrough came on April 3, 1943. At 14:23 hours, intercept stations picked up a brief transmission from U-634, a convoy sighting. By the time Bletchley Park decoded it 4 hours later, the message read, "Convoy spotted, grid BE-42, bearing 045, speed 8 knots, 40 vessels, moderate escort, standard intelligence. Useful but not immediately actionable. The convoy could alter course. The U-boat could lose contact. The information had a shelf life of hours, but Pembroke looked at it through his narrative framework. "This is our inciting incident," he told Margaret Blackwood. "Based on previous patterns from the operational zone and season, we'll see reconnaissance confirmation in 2 to 4 hours. Tactical coordination broadcast in 6 to 9 hours. Attack initiation in 16 to 20 hours. The convoy is designated SC-125. Current position places them here." He marked a chart. "Projected attack zone, accounting for convoy speed and typical U-boat approach patterns, will be here." Another mark, roughly 180 miles northeast. "You're guessing," someone said. "I'm reading ahead in the story," Pembroke replied. Margaret Blackwood made a decision that probably saved her career or ended it. "Divert destroyer HMS Vedette to this position." She pointed to Pembroke's predicted attack zone. "If Pembroke is wrong, we've wasted fuel. If he's right, we might save a convoy." 2 hours and 17 minutes later, intercept stations decoded a second U-boat transmission. Reconnaissance confirmation of SC-125. 7 hours after the initial sighting, German U-boat command broadcast tactical coordination to 4 submarines. 18 hours and 31 minutes after U-634's initial report, 3 U-boats surfaced to attack convoy SC-125 in exactly the grid coordinates Pembroke had predicted. HMS Vedette was waiting for them. The destroyer's searchlights caught U-634 on the surface. Depth charges bracketed U-456 before it could dive. The Wolfpack scattered. Not a single merchant vessel was hit. It worked. The next day, Margaret Blackwood gave Pembroke access to real-time intercepts and a team of 3 analysts. "Teach them your method," she said. "We're calling it Operation Storyboard." Within 6 weeks, Operation Storyboard was predicting U-boat attack locations with 73% accuracy. By July, accuracy reached 81%. The impact was immediate and devastating to the German submarine fleet. Convoys that should have been slaughtered sailed through U-boat operational zones untouched. Wolfpacks that coordinated complex multi-submarine attacks found destroyers waiting in ambush. Admiral Dönitz couldn't understand it. His commanders reported that Allied forces seemed to anticipate their movements with impossible precision. His submarines still transmitted encrypted messages. The Enigma machines still worked perfectly. But somehow the British were always in the wrong place at the wrong time. Wrong for the Germans, right for the Allies. The Admiralty deployed Pembroke's narrative analysis across the entire Atlantic theater. They trained 20 analysts in his methodology. They created standardized templates for different types of submarine operations: initial contact, shadowing, Wolfpack assembly, coordinated strike, disengagement. Each phase had predictable timing and communication patterns. By August 1943, U-boat losses exceeded replacement rates for the first time. Donitz withdrew submarines from the North Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had raged for 3.5 years, effectively ended. The numbers tell the story. March 1943. 67 Allied ships sunk, 627,000 tons. April 1943, after Pembroke's system was implemented. 39 ships, 235,000 tons. May 1943, 34 ships. June 1943, 17 ships. By September, fewer than 10 Allied vessels per month were lost to U-boats. Military historians later calculated that Pembroke's narrative analysis shortened the Battle of the Atlantic by 8 to 14 months. It saved an estimated 300,000 lives, Allied and neutral. It preserved roughly 12 million tons of shipping that would have otherwise been sunk. Churchill was briefed on Operation Storyboard in May 1943. According to declassified minutes, he said, "You're telling me we defeated the U-boat menace with literary criticism? Good God. The Nazis lose wars to Cambridge English majors. Perfect." Eisenhower, planning the eventual D-Day invasion, recognized that Pembroke's work made the invasion possible. Without control of the Atlantic, the massive buildup of men and materiel in Britain would have been impossible. Every Sherman tank, every artillery shell, every gallon of fuel needed for the invasion crossed the Atlantic safely. Largely because a radio playwright had recognized that German submarine commanders thought in stories. The methodology spread beyond submarine warfare. Analysts applied narrative structure analysis to Luftwaffe communication patterns, German tank division coordination, even Japanese naval operations in the Pacific. The fundamental insight that human military communication follows intuitive story patterns regardless of encryption became a cornerstone of signals intelligence. After the war, the newly formed National Security Agency in the United States studied Pembroke's techniques. So did the Soviet GRU. Modern military intelligence still uses modified versions of narrative pattern analysis for everything from terrorist cell communications to cyber warfare coordination. The innovation wasn't technological, it was cognitive. Pembroke had recognized that humans can't escape their own psychology. We think in stories. We communicate in narrative arcs. Even when we're trying to be coldly tactical and militarily precise, we structure information according to dramatic logic because that's how our brains process causality. A convoy sighting is only interesting because it implies a subsequent attack. An attack only makes sense if it's been set up properly with reconnaissance and coordination. The Germans couldn't help but communicate in story structures because there's no other way human cognition works at scale. Pembroke had weaponized narrative itself. 30 years later, in 1973, a BBC radio producer tracked down Arthur Pembroke for an interview. He was 67 years old, retired, living in a small cottage in Cornwall, still writing mystery stories for local radio, still earning about £12 a week. "The war work?" the producer asked, recording on a bulky reel-to-reel machine. "What you did at Bletchley Park, you must be proud." Pembroke looked uncomfortable. "I wasn't special. I was just a fellow who'd written too many detective serials. I saw patterns because I'd drawn the same patterns 1,000 times myself. Any hack writer could have done it. But you saved hundreds of thousands of lives." "Did I?" Pembroke poured tea with hands that had developed a slight tremor. Or did the German submarine service simply follow predictable operational patterns that anyone would have eventually noticed? "I don't think I was clever. I think I was available when someone needed to look at the problem differently." "The Admiralty gave you an OBE, They gave OBES to a lot of people. Most of them deserved it more. He smiled slightly. The real lesson isn't that I was brilliant. The real lesson is that the military establishment was smart enough to listen to someone with no credentials, no formal training, no business being there. Margaret Blackwood took a meeting with a radio playwright, presenting charts about story structure. That's the remarkable part. That's what won the war. What about after the war? You could have consulted, taught, written books about your experiences. I signed the Official Secrets Act. Pembroke shrugged. Besides, I'm a writer. Writers observe and record. We don't become the story. He died in 1979. The obituary in the Times was 3 paragraphs. Arthur Pembroke, radio playwright and wartime intelligence analyst, dead at 73. Contributed to signals intelligence efforts during World War II. Survived by his sister Margaret and numerous nephews and nieces. No mention of Operation Storyboard. No reference to the Battle of the Atlantic. No explanation that this unassuming man with no military background had fundamentally changed naval warfare. The full story remained classified until 1996. By then, most of the people who'd worked with him were dead. Today, there's a small exhibit at Bletchley Park. A recreation of Pembroke's office covered in his charts mapping narrative structures onto U-boat communications. A placard explaining his contribution. A photograph showing a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, looking vaguely uncomfortable in his civilian analyst uniform. The Imperial War Museum has his original notebooks. The pages are filled with his cramped handwriting, mixing plot diagrams with naval coordinates, story beats with tactical predictions. On one page, he'd written, "The Germans are telling us their story. We just need to learn how to read it." An American naval intelligence officer, writing in a 2003 analysis that was only declassified in 2015, said, Pembroke's insight was that warfare, at the operational level, is fundamentally narrative. Commanders think in story structures because that's how humans understand causality and time. He didn't crack codes. He read between them. He understood that the medium and the message are inseparable, and that human cognition is the real encryption. The German naval archives, opened after reunification, contain a fascinating detail. In August 1943, Admiral Dönitz ordered an investigation into how the British were predicting U-boat movements. His intelligence staff concluded that the Allies must have developed advanced direction-finding technology or broken a cipher the Germans didn't know was compromised. It never occurred to them that a radio playwright with no naval experience had simply recognized they were writing a story, and like all stories, it followed patterns, setups and payoffs, causes and effects, the eternal 3-act structure of beginning, middle, and end. Hitler's biggest secret wasn't the Enigma machine or the U-boat technology or the Wolfpack tactics. It was that his commanders were human. They thought in stories. They couldn't help it. It's built into our neurology, our evolution, the way we process information about cause and effect across time. And one failed radio novelist exposed it. Not with mathematics or technology or military genius, but with the simple recognition that we are all, always, telling ourselves stories. Even in the middle of the ocean. Even in the depths of war. Even when lives hang in the balance and the future of nations depends on radio silence. We are story-making creatures. And Arthur Pembroke understood that better than anyone. The U-boats never stood a chance against a man who'd spent his life learning how stories work. Because in the end, that's all warfare is, competing narratives, and Pembroke knew how to read them all.